House Foreign Affairs Committee deadline for documents this Friday at 5.
So there's been lots of discussion about this. I've read a number of reports. Let me say three things. First, the president has the unilateral right to choose who he wants to be his inspector general in every agency in the federal government. They're presidentially confirmed positions, and those persons, just like all of us, serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. In this case, I recommend it to the President. It's Steve Linnick.
So Mike Pompeo simply admits the fact that he was really the one who recommended the removal of the Inspector General named Steve Linnick, because this is the first time in open space Mike Pompeo, as head of the State Department, opens about his decision that was eventually executed by President Donald Trump to fire the Inspector General. But he clearly gives a concession to the recognition that has been suggested by the congressional leaders, including Grassley, who already actually received a briefing from him, but there was no sufficient detailed information that might actually provide the general with the necessary understanding about the situation. As the national security reporter Kali Atwood had mentioned, there was no enough meat. That means no flesh on the bone was provided to specify the issue by breaking the issue, and it was line by line. There were not enough points that might actually provide a sufficient understanding about the background, why he was removed in the first place. That's really the choice. So right now there has been a suggestion so far, following from the statement put out by the State Department. He was not actually following the guidelines concerning the ethos statement, which is really a mission statement put out by the Secretary of State, quote unquote, I'm the real champion of the American diplomacy, or something like that. And that he was constantly subject to media leaking with no authority, and he's very not cooperative with the leadership demonstrated by the Mike Pompeo. That's really the reason many people planted inside the State Department on behalf of Mike Pompeo complained about the possible disruption caused between the sects. This already actually indicated the hefty disputes in the form of sectarianism, because the people who are actually being part of the hierarchy by the career officials who were already part of the institution, that were somewhat distrustful of the Mike Pompeo's own people who were handpicked by his decision. That eventually, necessitated a certain type of a culture of insecurity. So people actually, do not agree upon the issue, even if they need to narrow down their position. There are certain type of troublesome disputes and disharmony caused along the party line. So if you are actually the people who are part of the State Department, regardless of the political season, then you would like to stick to, you would like to latch on to the policy or philosophy by Inspector General by portraying him as a dogged inspector, willing to unveil any malfeasance conducted by the public servants. However, the Mike Pompeo's people are very much grumbling about the unilateral decision that had been conducted by the Steve Linnick. But he, at least at this moment, clearly accepts the suspicion that he was really the one, even though he clarifies that President of the United States can definitely invoke his right to remove or replace any type of authorities, part of the government accountability authorities as watchdogs. Definitely that belongs to President's discretion, so any portion can be replaced. So there is no legal problem.
Frankly, should have done it some time ago.
He even actually said that he should have actually done some time ago. Tell the truth. You know what? There should have actually been a certain sense, which he could have, give a sense. This should have been done much earlier. It would have been much better if he would have been removed from the scene much earlier. That's really the suggestion to justify and rationalize his choice. That's very interesting. I'm not actually looking into any subtitle.
I'm happy to take one more.
You have said, sir, that Mr. Linick was undermining the department's mission. What exactly does that mean? Can you give us examples? Even the president doesn't know what that means. He says he didn't really know about the God before you mentioned it. So what specifically has Mr. Linick done?
Yeah, unlike others, I don't talk about personnel matters. I don't leak to y'all. And yeah, I'll just say this. I can't talk. I can't give you specificity. We'll share with the appropriate people the rationale, but no, there should be no mistake. There's
Official, is it a secret as to why he was fired?
answer the question, if you will. I appreciate the question. Let's be clear. There are claims that this was for retaliation for some investigation that the Inspector General's office here was engaged in. Patently false. No sense of what investigations were taking place inside the Inspector General's office. Couldn't possibly have retaliated for all the things. I've seen the various stories that someone was walking my dog to sell arms to my dry cleaner. I mean, it's all just crazy. It's all crazy stuff.
He just actually, you know what, at least it deposited his justification saying that it has something to do with the media coverage leaking because he was constantly opening up his mouth to drop something that was supposed to be classified. So we know what the subject matter at this moment can never be discussed with the media because it might actually, you know, breach yet another confidentiality. That's really the reason he just really wants to reserve this issue by actually, you know, leaving the responsibility to the representative media folks in the State Department to actually, you know what, at least even out the position, because there could be a very sensitized issue that might actually be opened up if he tries to explain why Linick was, you know, removed in the first place by exemplifying the very specified case. Because, you know what, he already actually, you know, clarified the situation saying that this had no indication about the retaliation. He just mentions that it's a flat out wrong to actually, you know, accuse me of, you know, seeking a political vindication by seeking revenge on him because of this conducted inquiry opened up by, you know, Inspector General Steve Linick, who just really wants to dig deeper about the, you know, his alleged abuse of authority and power simply to enrich his personal asset and wealth with his wife Susan Pompeo. That type of understanding can never be acceptable. And he just actually, you know what, says that there are many crazy lunatic arguments like that somebody actually, you know, walks his dog, you know what, to sell arms, you know what, trying to actually get money out of it, this type of trafficking, you know, many different arguments that were actually made. This type of lunatic, you know, arguments shall never be accepted in the realm of reason by actually, you know, putting this type of conspiracy theory right next to Steve Linick's, you know, possible removal because of the investigative works he had conducted against Pompeo. He actually put these two things together to classify both of them as a ridiculous and lunatic conspiracy theory. That's really the reason you probably notice that he's very desperate to downplay any type of chances that this type of layoff was greatly motivated by his private and personal interest in return of the inquiry and investigation conducted by the Steve Linick to go deeper into the possible abuse of his seat. And he has already actually stated that Steve Linick was greatly undermining the mission statement of the department by not actually, you know what, having him fall into line. That type of argument was already actually made, but he actually, you know, refuses to declassify the classified matter by actually breaching on something that should actually be reserved depending upon his discretion because of the confidentiality. He really believes that the sensitive security issue should never be breached just simply to actually exonerate himself. Yeah, just simply to rationalize the removal of a Steve Linick can never be a good enough that might actually, you know, bring him to open up his mouth, right?
So I didn't have access to that information, so I couldn't possibly have retaliated. It would have been impossible. There's one exception. I was asked
Mhm.
That's not someone who I look to for ethics guidance, and so I'll continue to do the right thing, make sure the State Department is served by every employee, including our attorney and inspector general. We'll make sure the State Department continues to deliver.
So right now, he's been actually trying to mitigate any possible suggestion that he was motivated by the political retaliation, and Linick was actually trying to prosecute him, or at least penalize him by actually digging up the dirt related to his own personal matter. But he actually completely denied any chances that he would be pursuing in that nature. But those people who are constantly stalking up this type of suspicions, they're actually being fed up the information from the Senator Menendez's office. You remember Bob Menendez. Tell the truth, he somehow actually made Bob Menendez a laughingstock. Truly, there's a senator from New Jersey who actually had a history of being prosecuted because of the bribery case several years ago. He was really close to losing his seat at the time, but he managed to survive this in a bidding for whatever reason. It's very surprising. I still remember that. I thought that he was actually done deal, but he somehow made his comeback. He's a Democrat. But the thing is, he said that, if honestly, I do not actually, take the guideline, especially the ethics guideline from a person who already actually was prosecuted for bribery charges. It's a guideline, 15/155, 155. That's really the ethics guideline. If you ever actually look deeper into the bipartisan ethics guideline, you would never actually realize that this type of argument can be acceptable. Those people who are already heavily tainted with the immorality or morally troublesome behaviors, it's really like, Cattle's calling the pot black, but the thing is, he refuses to acknowledge his wrongdoing, so he just actually makes a big deal out of it, discrediting Bob Menendez, calling the Senator Menendez as a guy who already actually was significantly hampered in terms of sticking to moral prosecution because of his past history, so he has no right to even invoke the ethics guideline. This type of guidance is from the very beginning flawed, because he has no right and entitlement to invoke the ethics guideline because of his own history of being prosecuted for taking bribes from campaign supporters in connection with the political finance. Because of the political finance of bribery, he was prosecuted.
What about the House Foreign Affairs Committee,
Well, have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. That's what we're...
This pandemic. The CDC is now saying Trump's White House is putting politics ahead of science in an eye-opening new report in which experts at the leading infectious disease group say, what's tough is that if we would have acted earlier on what we knew and recommended, we would have saved lives and money.
That's really interesting. Those people who are actually, from the infectious disease experts, they're actually saying that what would it be the consequence if we would have acted much earlier by actually listening to those, pieces of advice that would be bound by the science in the realm of tough science, not actually putting the politics or calculation above to be strictly tailored and trained by the hardcore science. Then what would it be the consequential effect we might be seeing at this moment? At least, we could have expected to have more people rescued. And definitely no need to actually mention further things about the monetary values definitely picked up by this administration. Because, after the segregation, probably the economy would enjoy a much quicker return to normalcy. That would have been much, much expectable and anticipated if and only if the Trump administration was decent enough to pay heed to the tips and recommendations and suggestions delivered by those infectious disease experts who are the leading voice in the community to have a specific idea how things eventually had turned out. That's what has been actually said. 155. It's really true. Ethics guideline 15/155. So, she actually, clarifies the situation. No matter how you slice and dice Donald Trump's handling of the crisis, it's very difficult to give out a good judgment. He eventually botched up handling the proper crisis that's been overwhelming the American territory, and he fails to recognize the danger ahead of time. He did not actually expect this type of full-blown attack dwarfing on the nation. He did not actually, characterize the upcoming danger at the time with the proper foresight expected from someone in leadership position. He just simply did not actually, truly evoke any type of insightful, visionary capabilities that should have been there to think ahead and move forward with the discretion on behalf of the people who are at least not just, fighting against the coronavirus, who are actually, throwing their bodies in fear. That type of a suggestion was noticed. Because by any metrics, doesn't matter what type of a playbook you just really want to resort to, the consequential conclusion that would actually reach the final day of judgment is really clear. Donald Trump can never actually be pardoned from this fiasco because he's been right now busy dropping distractions. Because, constantly mentioning those former presidents, including President Obama and George W. Bush, that would be nothing but a dog and pony show that would simply want to distract the public interest away from his mismanagement, simply downgrading the pending danger, because his entire team is his entire team is obsessed with resuming and bringing back the entire economy by kick-starting it again. This type of more work of economy should be, resumed. Otherwise, there would be a great challenge that might darken his chances of being reelected. So all he's thinking about is now rebooting the more of American industry. No matter how many more people would die out, this type of dire consequences, they're not greatly appreciated. So he's been actually twisting the arms of the CDC scientists, trying to actually put politics over science. This is not mind over matter, politics over science. Trying to actually, have a politics, dark influence completely eclipse what's been truthful and what's been justifiable and quantifiable based upon the hard science. That could actually be the one which he already could have possibly saved millions. But the thing is, it didn't happen, and there's no sign of at least leaning to that choice. Now that's interesting. That's not my opinion.
Despite that updated guideline from the CDC, many scientists are still concerned that contaminated surfaces could transmit the coronavirus. And with all states now scheduled to reopen in some fashion or other tomorrow, we wanted to see what that might mean for people who eat at restaurants who may be exposed to germs or even coronavirus droplets. Randy Kay went to a lab in Florida to see if science can provide any answers.
Put some in. And should I rub it all together as well? This yellow-tinted goo is a mixture of petroleum jelly and fluorescent solution.
Under an ultraviolet light, this will glow.
Okay, and that's going to simulate germs on my hand.
Correct. So this will simulate contact spread, from you to other things that you touch and maybe touched by someone else.
Dr. Patrick Hughes is an ER doctor who oversees the emergency medicine simulation program at Florida Atlantic University. Hi, ladies. Hi. He invited us to lunch, designating me the so-called spreader.
So we could see how germs on my hand, which could be coronavirus droplets, could spread in a restaurant setting. At our table, we keep our masks on to protect ourselves and each other.
Yeah, sure, thanks.
I pour water for everyone at the table.
This is great. Thanks for having us for lunch.
Sure. And pass around the food, wondering if I'm passing around the virus too.
Oh, yeah, awesome. Thank you. Do you want a big bowl?
We also share the salt and pepper. Then it's time to turn on the ultraviolet lights to see what I may have spread. Remember, I was the only one with what could have been the virus on my hand.
You didn't have any germs on you. I was the spreader. So when you look at my hands and look how it transferred to some of you just by sharing items at the table or a knife in this case or a water glass. I mean, even it only takes a little bit, right, to make somebody else sick.
How about that?
This is really interesting. There is a new guideline that has just been released by the CDC, somewhat in retracting the information about the surface infection. But the thing is, Randy K is right now conducting the very interesting experiment by putting up on a petroleum jelly mixture with the fluorescent ink. If you ever actually put it underneath the ultraviolet ray, you would actually see that how many droplets that were supposed to be germs are actually spread throughout the hand by having a simple meal together with other people. So you would actually probably notice that she's been actually, carrying out this on behalf of the rest of the people to see how many people would actually be affected by the germs and sharing, kitchenware or silverware or dining together or sharing the common, dining table together or even actually using, cookingware like silver cutlery, like knife, or chopsticks, or spoons, or tongs, or bowls, and salad bowls, or dishes, anything that might actually be shareable, right? So Patrick Hugh is a really emergency simulation doctor who's been actually working for the Florida Atlantic University. So right now, what's been so interesting at this moment is how quickly these germs that were actually, at least symbolized by this droplets, which are composed of the petroleum jelly and the fluorescent ink. Fluorescent is really the neon light that would actually be shiny substance by being luminescent, right? And the petroleum jelly is like Vaseline. If you ever actually, have a chapped skin during the winter season, you need to put up on a petroleum jelly, right? It's really helpful and it's really cheap. Tell the truth, I'm not really so sure about the side effects of health-wise concerns that might actually be caused by petroleum jelly. But the thing is, that's very interesting. So, she actually shared the meal. Just having, water, pour from jars to cups and glasses, and she actually shared salad bowls with a tongue in it, and trying to at least carve out the meal and portion, and trying to actually pass the meals, even actually handing out the pepper and the salt grinders and the shakers to actually have the regular dining experience, right? So after one round of the meeting, they just actually turned out the light to have their hands underneath the ultraviolet ray, which you would identify the very onset of the droplets. So, it would be very shocking, tell the truth. Just, spending a couple of minutes together by dining together and eating together at the same table, sharing the same silverware, cutlery, and the dishes, or cookingware and earthware. You've somehow spread a germ. They were really, in the first place, never been exposed to these droplets. Randy K was really the only person Randy K was really the only person who was already contaminated with the simulated droplets that were, imagine that these are really the germs. But the problem is, they were quickly spread. Already people who share in a common space for a couple of minutes, they actually, found themselves contaminated with the droplets that were supposed to be not there in the first place. That means this type of transmission, by having a contact with each other through the surface, would be that much easy. This is definitely a simulation. This is really kind of dramatized reenaction and reenactment to see how quickly germs are being spread by simple contact. This is really dedicated to witness of how quickly these droplets are being dispersed into the air, and that would actually eventually land on someone else's body by having a simple contact. This type of contact dissemination is what's been at focal point at this moment. It's very fascinating to witness what's going on here. But don't get that wrong. The CDC guideline that I actually read was, much later published by the Centers for Disease Prevention and Control. This is really something that I actually read much later. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, this is really the guideline that was given out by them much earlier. And I actually misstated their name. If you ever actually want me to say this once more, Centers for and Prevention. Because it was really about to see, how much she may have spread the germs that were supposed to be her own, but none of the participants around the table were already exposed to them ahead of time. But simple interaction in close distance can actually multiply this much efficient and effective contact spread. That's what has been initiated here. You can actually guess that, right? It's very surprising. There was, oh, no. I can actually do this really quickly.
Bowl of chips I passed around.
You can see where she touched the edge of the bowl to pass it around. The simulated germs, stuck right to the surface.
Mm-hmm. So, in the salad bowl, it's really technically a bowl of chips, right? This bowl is normally called a salad bowl, regardless of the contents. This type of widened bowl is a salad bowl. In the first place, this bowl was filled with chips. The very crispy, crunchy chips, right? But the simple bowl, already touched by her fingers multiple times, the actual surface was already taped up and plastered with the droplets that truly symbolize the germs. That means it's very easy to notify, on the surface. Hard surface made of plastic is really great and a safe haven for these germs to survive and continue. But the problem is, for how many hours they would continue to survive and thrive in this condition. Because it's not my opinion. However, the CDC changed its guideline to rescind very strict the interpretation and the interpretation of the germ spread on the surfaces. It has been clarified much later. You don't really necessarily need to pay that much attention about the surface-to-surface the interaction. Even if you actually purchase groceries, like purchasing, zucchinis or courgettes or even eggplants or anything, you don't really need to wash it multiple times with the excessively elevated attention. It's a red herring. Red herring, that's what has been actually said, according to the modulated CDC guideline that has been recently submitted through different channels, including the NPR. I actually read the news article published by them. Including the multiple channels. NPR is one of them, obviously.
Everybody else touches the bowl. Same with the salt and pepper shakers and the pitcher of water. There was contact spread on the cups and menus, too.
Wow. You know what? You would actually notice that the water pitcher is heavily stacked up with and bedecked with germs, and the menu card is also covered with the fluorescent and luminescent materials that truly symbolize nothing but a germ contamination. And salt and pepper shakers or salt and pepper grinders are equally the same one. They're equally already heavily affected by the germs. This type of contact spread is very, stifling. Contact spread means you actually grab something by simply having, a closer relationship. By coming into contact with it, you just interact with someone, handshakes, or hugging, or even actually grabbing a cell phone, or having a mouth pad touched, or even actually, your, forks are being actually shared. You actually decide to allocate a fork and chopsticks in the first place, and these type of efforts are all a promotional activity to have a multiplied number of germs stacking up to stifle the surface. That's very shocking. Water pitcher also.
This is the spot where when Randy came in to have lunch with her friends, she touched right on the shoulder just to greet everybody, and you can see the outline of her palm print.
Wow. This is really the place, where Randy K just came in to actually greet everyone, say hi and hello and nice to meet you, and have a meal with, so many different people. And she just actually stayed here, for a brief amount of time. She wanted to actually, hang out with her friend. So she just actually, greeted and, grabbed and touched many different objects and stayed here briefly. Then her paint prints, the actual traces, were so inevitable to be palpable and visible because we actually concocted a petroleum jelly with a fluorescent ink. Fluorescent ink is really that has a color like fluorescent, so it could be visible even with ultraviolet ray, which can be detectable. The UV ray can actually distinguish this type of line. Even light would be off, this would actually be shiny and luminescent to identify itself. So this is a very interesting argument.
Right on the shirt. It's quite scary, the amount of spread that one person
Takes a
can
closer
have
look
on
at.
like that.
It's quite scary, how one person within that short amount of time can do this. CNN's Randy K takes a closer look at. I actually read it. No, I don't need to. It's quite scary how one person eventually moves on to spread this many droplets simply by having a contact. That means that we should never actually cross out the contact contamination. If you are actually touching the common shared spot and object, then this might actually multiply the chances of contaminating the products across the surface and the floor. This would be very much disastrous. That's what has been indicated, right? And what has been actually written down on the screen was CNN's Randy K takes a closer look at how the germs are being spread in time of the coronavirus by having a simple contact.
I also wanted to see what would happen if you're out for lunch or dinner with a friend or your family at a restaurant and somebody coughs. So let's turn out the lights and let's see the cough. There were now more droplets on the bowl of chips, the menus, and the water pitcher too. Look what happened to the fork after that simulated cough. Those would be real germs if that was a real cough. On my fork, I would have picked up the fork.
Oh my gosh, if you are actually, imagine that if you were invited to your, friend's house and have a meal together, but somebody actually coughs. Then this type of simulated coughs will truly speed out the mucus from the body. But the problem is that these tiny droplets are actually vaporized and spread into the air to have, a micromillimeter droplets covering up covering up the entire region. You would actually see that the fork, the surface of the shiny fork, is really completely protected with the tiny droplets. Micromillimeter, nanometer microparticles. They're all germs. These are all propagated versions of a coronavirus that could eventually penetrate into your respiratory organs through your mouth or nose, your nasal and oral cavity. This would be all visible. Imagine how quickly the germ and virus could actually be easily spread. The simple coughing and sneezing, that would change eventually everything. Make sure to actually close up your mouth while you're coughing. Definitely everyone knows it at this point really well. Not just using a simple surface of your finger or hand, using a sleeve or cuff to completely, cover your mouth away. Make sure to use a towel or handkerchief or cuff or sleeve, sleeve here. If you are actually wearing a hand half sleeve, then you need to make sure to close your mouth. This is very important.
Not being able to see those germs with the naked eye. Even the woman's
No one would actually be allowed to watch it as, with naked eyes. If you are not actually wearing a protective goggles, or if you are not actually employing this specified material called ultraviolet ray, no one can actually see, this micromillimeter, unnoticeable, invisible germs on the surface with the naked eyes without being assisted by the special equipment, right?
Sitting to my right, several feet away from the mannequin that coughed, had droplets on her face.
Wow. Unbelievable. She was actually staying, at least, several inches away, at least several feet away from that mannequin. That, effigy was, pretty much away from her. That lady's face was covered with the droplets. Her facial surface was definitely plastered with tiny droplets that truly represent germ and virus contamination. Even though, she was, away from that dummy, you would actually see that, coughing and spitting, dummy as an effigy was installed to actually be, several feet away from her, but she was still actually within the boundary of this vaporization. This is really powerful to speed out the droplets at once, as if surmounting any type of physical or geolocational boundaries. This is really unbelievable, right? If you ever actually look into her face under a special light, you would actually notice that these fluorescent tiny droplets are truly making her face polka dot, right? It's right, her face. It's dotted with the tiny small spots. It's very, very interesting. She all of a sudden became a polka dot. To actually have a tiny droplet, completely pointing the every corner of her face. This is unbelievable. That dummy, you can actually also call that effigy, used for experiment, set up by this emergency simulation professor whose name is Patrick Hughes at the Florida's Atlantic University, truly bears this great consequence. So coughing and sneezing or even vomiting can be very much, dangerous to at least, have much, great pulsating power to propel any type of bodily fluids out of one's mouth and nose to reach multi-million miles. Because tiny microparticles could go further and definitely physically farther. If you ever actually go farther distances, it could actually travel at least several miles.
You can see it's on her face, her glasses, her mask.
If she wasn't wearing a mask, she would have breathed it in.
Correct.
Oh my gosh. So you can actually see that, her glasses were also affected, her face and forehead, and her mask was also partially covered up with the tiny droplets, right? That means if she was not carrying a mask, in the case, for not this mask, she could have easily contracted this virus. So we can easily imagine that the mask is really a proper medical gear, which could actually save our life. Otherwise, her nasal and oral cavity would have been much, much vulnerable to be susceptible to germs penetration through the contact infection. Because of this type of contact would multiply the surface, especially to be met with the droplets dissemination. That's very troublesome. So if you ever actually imagine that, in a hypothetical scenario, if she would not actually carry her mask, she would have easily influenced by the germs, and there would be greater probabilities to have her infected with the coronavirus, right?
And Randy joins us now. So what did the doctor there advise when it comes to dining out? I mean, obviously, don't be sharing menus and other items.
Right. I mean, it was pretty gross, Anderson, as you could see. So the doctor that
So what are these doctors see about, dining out? It's really actually, gross. Tell the truth, not really true, and gross, But, sharing the menus or, silverware. Sometimes, people actually, anyway, somebody who visited had you use that silverware. So you actually need to share a dish or even water jar or pitchers and bottles or anything. Right, salt and pepper grinders and shakers, or napkins, or even napkin holder, anything that would actually be within the reachable distance. That would be absolutely the great, haven for giving a sanctuary place for germs. Definitely. We can never actually rule that out. The virus can definitely find it's a sanctuary city where people would actually really like to touch. And when people's tactile organ can be comparable with an object, then this should never be ruled out in terms of it being a vulnerable virus shelter, probably.
We spoke with, I asked him, I said, so would you go out? And granted, he's very busy working in the ER, but he said, no, I would not go out to eat right now. He said, people really should think long and hard about that. But the real question.
So, this, ER doctor, emergency doctor, who's been actually, working on emergency stimulation instances, trying to at least dramatize the situation, to better equip people with medical knowledge and preventive measures. So, she actually asked him, would you like to go out? Would you really like to dine out and go out for eating? People should really think hard about the choices. He said no, adamant. It's really because he had no time, but definitely he's been actually absolutely certain about actually, preparing, something that would be edible by himself, not really actually going out to grab something for eat. He is not in the mood for doing so at this moment. Why is it so? Because there would be such an exponentially multiplied probabilities. It's not really possibilities, probabilities of being infected with the coronavirus. If you decide to bring yourself out and enjoy this restaurant experience, then this is the beginning of the disaster. But I don't really want to actually have this, gastronomic industry go out of business. Probably there could be, greater helps if you ever, pick up your phone or use your, Uber application or whatever to actually place an order, have a meal delivered. Because, what CDC says, deliver a meal, that would be contained in the container would possibly be already, cooked and heated. So, virus cannot actually thrive in that nature. Maybe, the CDC right now somehow slackens its tough restrictions influenced by the politics. I don't know. I cannot actually guarantee anything. But this is also the echo voiced by the Food and Drug Administration, which really said that you cannot actually, think hard about the germ dissemination and propagation if this food was prearranged to be enclosed in the container. Then it's really fine to actually take it under the condition that it was fully cooked. So I highly recommend to heat it up using, a heat or sterilizing oven or stove to make sure any type of a virus desiccated. Yeah, you can actually say that any type of virus that would be desiccated for sure,
If you do go out, and the problem is, Anderson, as you know, you can't wear a mask if you're eating out, you can't wear gloves depending on the kind of food you're eating, and in some of these cities you can't even social distance because the restaurants are very tight quarters, so that makes sense.
So it's also very, frightening, because if you are actually, dining out, the first thing you need to do is to take off your, masks. There's no one who can actually, eat themselves while having a mask, even if you have a tiny hole in the mask. What's the purpose of, wearing a mask if you cannot actually, shut down your mouth, right? So it's really somewhat ridiculous, right? So if you ever have meals at the local diners or bistros or fine dining places, doesn't matter. You have to actually share the small space. Most of it, in most of, metropolitan area, especially the big cities, restaurants are likely to be pretty much densely packed up space. There are not exceptionally capacious to have enough room for social distancing. That means, people who are actually, packed up inside the room like sardines in a jar, they cannot actually, keep the social distancing guidelines by being very, very dedicated to them, because they do not in the first place guarantee, proper square feet that might actually be good enough to keep them apart. Because while eating, definitely more bodily fluids, or whether that would be. mucus or saliva, doesn't matter. Any type of bodily fluids are likely to come out of your body if you actually take in any substance that would be heated up. Because this would be very dangerous. If you, imagine that if you actually drink hot coffee or enjoy spicy hot, soup, this could definitely heat up the metabolism to actually, activate the bodily function and physiology to bring out and secrete more of a mucus. Then this would be the very dangerous spot. Because, through the bodily fluids, people really likely to contract coronavirus, and this is really the vulnerability one should definitely avoid it, but there is no space for keeping the social distancing, and that's worse. Depending upon the menus, you cannot always guarantee that you might actually wear gloves, right? So if you have a Rapster, you can probably have a gloves, right? Latex gloves, disposable gloves. You can actually definitely carry that. But the problem is you cannot wear a mask while you're eating. That's really the problem. And for most of the big cities, restaurants are not really that, capacious or copious place, which might actually give you a proper enough space, right? This would be, a very much restricted physical